Report.
This is Dan Jerk.
This is Jason J. Lewis, the voice of Superman on Justice League Action.
This is Mark Wade, writer of Superman Birthright.
And you're listening to
The All Things Kryptonian podcast, including Superman and Supergirl.
We discuss games, movies, cartoons, TV shows, and comics.
Find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
Welcome to the Krypton Report. I am Tyler, the man of tomorrow, the Superman of blue, and I have a special guest with me today. It's not the usual Mr. James Cole. No. I have a fellow podcaster who is as enthusiastic about movies and Superman as I am, who I have listened to his show for years, and I've come to realize that he has a great opinion when it comes to movies that I enjoy. So I'm always like, if he liked it, I'm probably going to like it. But I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. Zaki Hasan.
Hi, thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. It's truly an honor to have you on the show as a fellow podcaster and movie aficionado, I guess. That'd be a good one to kind of.
I'll take it.
Yeah. If you want to give a quick shout out to your podcasts and where people can find and hear those, go ahead.
Yeah, if you go to iTunes or any of the podcast platforms, just type in the Movie Film Podcast, one word, Movie Film, and that is the show hosted by myself and my partner Brian Hall. We drop episodes usually every 2 weeks with occasional movie commentary tracks in between. We talk about new releases, all the headlines, and we do commentaries for classic films as well.
And I will say, like, as much as I enjoy your regular show, I really like when you guys do commentary tracks.
Nice.
It's just one of those things where the films that you guys always do, I can't think of a film that you've done that I don't know enough by heart that I don't have to really watch the film while you discuss it. So it makes a nice kind of like listening to you guys talk and just driving or doing stuff around the house or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, that is a good point. Yeah. Recently, let's see, what was the most recent one you did? I know you did The Force Awakens.
We did Force Awakens, and we just dropped Tremors a couple days ago.
Yeah, I haven't listened to Tremors yet. I don't get to drive as much as I used to, like for work and everything, because that was always my go-to was like podcasts. Now my commute's like less than 10 minutes, so it takes me a while to listen to a podcast. But one thing, like a couple episodes back, I had brought up when we were discussing preparing for the premiere of Superman and Lois, your tweet that you had put after you saw, because Zaki is a film critic, and he had posted after viewing, you said the first couple of episodes, was it?
The first two.
Two. You had posted about it being, and now I'm paraphrasing, I had it in front of me, but it's been a long day, and I'm losing my voice thanks to my day. You had talked basically that Superman and Lois seemed like a very adequate Superman, blending both the Christopher Reeve era and what we had gotten with like the Man of Steel. And the way you had worded it was beautifully elegant, and I actually quoted it on that episode. But it was just, to me, it reaffirmed like I'm excited for this show. It's showing me what I want to see in my character, and I'm going to share this with people because if Zaki's saying it's good, it's going to be good.
Nice.
So, one thing is you're a big Christopher Reeve Superman fan.
I am, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
That kind of goes without saying. So, just for our listeners here, can you tell us about the first time you were exposed to the character of Superman?
Well, it would have to have been either the first or second film. I think when I was a little kid, those kind of blurred together.
Same.
The second one came out, what? It was like 80, 81, something like that. Right?
Yeah, it was like 3-year gap. I think it was something like that. Like, it's kind of astounding when you think about how much was already made, that it took that long to get. But movies worked differently back then, you know? But that's always kind of blown me away when I've gotten older and kind of looked back like, wow, that was a nice little gap there.
almost too long. I mean, I guess the world moved just a little slower back then, so there was still some enthusiasm. But yeah, I mean, it's in my childhood memory, it's impossible to separate the first and the second movie. They were both kind of a lump. So I mean, for me, Christopher Reeve was Superman, and so that was my first exposure to the character. And then in terms of the comics, I have very distinct memories of buying an issue off the rack of a 7-Eleven store down the street from where we were living in the suburbs of Chicago, and it had this Gil Kane cover. It was beautiful, and it had this little kid dressed up as Superman, and I remember loving the cover and not as much loving the interiors, which were by Kurt Swan. So my relationship with Superman, at least initially, was really liking the movie version and not having any real affinity for the comic books at the time. And the issue, by the way, is 388. So this is like, when would that have been? Like 1982 or 83, something like that. I didn't get into the comic books until the John Byrne reboot, which 86 or so, and actually my first, when I started buying Superman comics, it was actually a couple of years after Byrne left. My very first issue that I remember buying, because I lived in Chicago when I was a kid. I moved to Saudi Arabia when I was like 3 or 4, and so I spent about 10 years there. And one of the few comic books that was available there was The Adventures of Superman. So very first issue of Adventures of Superman I bought was when the Eradicator creates the Fortress of Solitude, and the cover says Eradicated or something like that. And it was Dan Jurgens, inked by one of the Kubert brothers. I think it was Andy Kubert. And so that issue has like very clear memory in my mind. But from there, I worked backwards and forward. And so for me, the post-crisis John Byrne version of Superman is my Superman.
It's so interesting, just when you kind of look at certain things in perspective. Like one of my friends right now, he has been reading Superman comics straight. He started a while back with Action Comics 1. He's been working his way straight. And, it's been really interesting because we'll talk about the different portrayals and things, and he'll talk about, well, in the comics at this time, like this wasn't how this was, or this, how this wasn't. And it's really interesting to get that perspective. He's now made it to the 90s in his reading. And it's so interesting because when you think back, like, I remember, like you were saying, as a kid, Superman 1 and 2 blurred in my head. The version I had was a off-TV taped version. And I think it was where they played them back to back or something, I still to this day can watch Return of the Jedi, and I can tell you when the commercial breaks were. Because
it's funny, my partner Brian says the exact same thing about Return of the Jedi specifically. And the commercials were here. The commercials were here.
Yep, because until they did that 1997 THX trilogy release, all I had was Return of the Jedi from TV. And so when you look at it, like you watch the Christopher Reeve Superman, and as a modern person, you could be like, well, that's weird. Why isn't Lex Luthor running LexCorp or Luthor Corp or Rich? And you're like, well, we hadn't had that John Byrne reboot yet. And you're like, oh, okay. So it kind of puts certain things in perspective. Like when you get to Lois and Clark, where you're kind of like, man, Clark is too cool of a guy. But then when you look at where, Clark was in the comics at the time, you're like, oh, that makes sense now. While this version is what we're getting, and it's one of those things that Christopher Reeve's Superman in his film is so much of a large shadow that no matter what has been done in the comics, and you can do a modern version of that character, people always will be like, well, Clark's supposed to be more like this. I'm like, yeah, but at the same time, what Chris did was never exactly with what was going on in the comics at the time. He took it to a new level, and it's interesting that has been so profound in just the character that even people who've read the comics, that's still like the way they identify the character. Burns we recently read Burns' Man of Steel.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't read it in several years. And I was looking at it, I was like, the first issue to me, if you were writing comics now, would have been a good, easy 3 issues. They would have filled that out, padded that out. Because I feel like that's your reboot right there in the first issue. And then issues after that are like, they're not like a continuity. It's like monumental steps in his career.
Yeah.
So, my partner James had never read it until this. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've read it. It's been years. We'll go and read it together. And then as we're doing it, I'm like, man, this is really interesting the way this is written. Because I thought in my brain that Man of Steel was like the miniseries into the reboot and was kind of more chronological. But as we were reading that first issue, I'm like, okay, so here's his reboot origin story, growing up, and now he's Superman, and all in one issue. That would not fly today.
No. I mean, I think the I think it's 6 issues, right?
Yeah.
The 6 issues, basically by the end, like it spans like a good 10 years, I think.
Yeah, that was another thing that was getting me as we were reading this. I'm like, okay, there's lines of dialogue where he's talking with Lois and references to Lex about elapses of time. And I'm like, wow. Like, this is, because like issue 1 is his origin. Issue 2 is meets Batman, meets Lois, meets Lex. It's just like these high points of his career. And I was like, I recommend reading it, but it's just so interesting from a modern comic reader, because I read a lot of Superman hit and miss. It was very hard to find comics. The best place I actually found comics was when my dad would take me to this little shop where he would get for his uniform. He was in the service, like ribbons or special like buttons or stuff like to fix or pieces of uniform he needed to buy. There was a spinner rack there. And that's the closest I had to like a comic place to go until I got older. So Superman comics were hit and miss, because one birthday I got one of those Christmas gift boxes, It was full of Batman, Superman comics, and then I had the VHS of the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, like, that was, kind of what I had until later when you could actually start to get a hold of media. And it's very interesting hearing the type of stories of, like, now when my son goes to tell, when were you exposed to Superman? He says, well, I first saw Superman here, and we watched this, and then I watched this, like, in a week. I knew everything there was to know about this character within a week, because my dad had every DVD there is possible. And for people like our age, it's a little bit more scarce. It's like, well, I only saw it here because, like, the film wasn't available to rent, or maybe it was showing on cable TV, or, whatever. It's such an interesting ride to hear where people kind of found this character that don't have all the options like we do today.
Right.
So we're just gonna kind of continue through just high points of Superman and, like, what the character's meant to you and where you think the character's going, and just some thoughts, some kind of chat on whatever, because it's just fun. Especially with, we'll kind of jump ahead, but I don't think you and Brian have covered this yet, so maybe I'm getting an opinion before he hears it. But the whole J.J. Abrams producing and idea of a Superman reboot, this is a story that's been blown up, misquoted, misshared, that it's going crazy. What are your thoughts just on a Superman reboot first, just a reboot in general?
Yeah, I think more than anything, that's what irks me, is sort of there is sort of like a Hollywood mentality of, this didn't work. Let's just, hit reset. I've used this example before. I had a friend who used to play Atari all the time, and when I was a kid, and he had this habit of, when you're playing back in those days, you had like whatever 4 lives. If he lost a single life, he would just reset the whole game.
Oh, I had a friend that did that on Mario,
right?
And I never thought about. I forgot that, so you brought that up.
So to me, that was like, I remember when The Amazing Spider-Man came out in 2012. I felt like that. I was like, all right, Spider-Man 3 wasn't great, but there's still enough juice in the tank to do a 4th one, and I think people would be fine with it. Nope, we lost 1 life, got to start over. And that's what it feels like with Superman. I felt that way after Superman Returns, which I think has its flaws, but I think there was enough there to do something else with using the parts that were already there. But they're like, nope, we lost a life, start over. And then with Man of Steel, in essence, the film never truly got a pure sequel, right? We got the Team Up movie, we got the Justice League movie, and those are, I almost consider those spin-offs more than true sequels. We never got the true Man of Steel sequel, and already Warner Brothers is like, nope, let's go back to formula. And I think that's unfortunate to me, because I've said this numerous times. I feel like Henry Cavill was sculpted out of marble to play Superman. Right? And the idea that you're just going to be like, nope, sorry, that irks me, because I'm like, you have a great Superman here. And I like Man of Steel quite a bit. I'm like, the pieces are there. Fine. If you're not happy with the way some of these follow-ups turned out, that's fine. Give him another chance. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So more to me, I'm just like, God, I could go the rest of my life without ever seeing yet another version of Krypton explode. Mm-hmm. That's where I'm at,
Well, I look at, everyone forgets, okay, that The Incredible Hulk was a soft reboot of Hulk.
Right.
Like, that was kind of this sequel-ish to Hulk. Mm-hmm. And I think that Superman Returns had that opportunity to make a sequel, which I think originally was going to be called Man of Steel. Because I just remember that term being used.
That's correct, yeah.
Before, they could have done Superman Returns, like, now let's kind of soft reboot it, kind of like, all right, we'll change it up a little bit and continue. Because like you said, you have the essence there. And then Man of Steel comes along and is basically the antithesis of Superman Returns.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, oh, Superman Returns, no action, too much like Donner, blah, blah, blah. And then Man of Steel's like, all right, action. Steps into a whole new direction. And I'm with you where I'm like, if you're not giving me something new with the character, like, we'll talk about it in a moment. Like, Superman and Lois is about taking Superman to a place we've never seen him on screen, film, TV before, and doing a new story farther down his life.
That's right.
Awesome. But I don't feel like, like you, I don't want to see Krypton blow up. I don't want to go through the beginnings again. I want to see this character continue his journey. Back to what you said about Spider-Man. I felt like The Amazing Spider-Man, when they first were talking about it, I was like, man. But then they talked about, putting him back in high school and getting a younger actor. I'm like, oh, okay. But then they get Andrew Garfield, who was like 28 at the time, And I'm like, okay. And then they're like, in high school. Then the next one, they're like, okay, graduation. Boom, out once again. And I'm like, all right. And then I'm like, the Lizard, which the Lizard would have worked great for a Spider-Man 4 because you'd already introduced Kurt Connors in little bits in the other 2 films. So we already had kind of a familiarity with this character and actor. So when he goes on this emotional journey, we're there with him like we've been there for a little while. And, when they rebooted Spider-Man, they put him in the MCU. It kind of made sense because, like, we want him over here in the MCU.
Yeah.
But we're going to do something different with Spider-Man. So they found a way to do Spider-Man without giving him an origin film and give us something new. And with Superman, it's kind of like, I want that something new. I don't want to go back to Baby Cal, like Explosion of Krypton. I just want to move forward in the story. Now, on the other note to that, this is where things have gotten kind of crazy, is the person who is writing it, had recently written something for Michael B. Jordan, a film him and Ryan Coogler were doing. So immediately, people have said that it's going to be a black Superman. We have two prominent characters that are Superman, that are black, African-American Superman, in the comics. Now, I think out of the two, we have Calvin Ellis and Val Zod. I think Calvin Ellis would be a more interesting film because I feel like Val Zod's a little bit more convoluted. his story, his origin, that
Right.
if you're not building off of something, just like dropping you into his story is rough. Calvin Ellis is a little bit different because he is the president of the United States. He's Superman on his own Earth. There's not that kind of tie to the Clark Kent Superman the way Val Zod is.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, if you're going to do this, are you connecting it to something? Are you, but all we know is there's a new film being produced by J.J. Abrams and written by this person's name I can't pronounce. I have not heard it said out loud, so I don't even want to try it until I hear it.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Okay, there we go. You heard it here, people. I have a bad thing about, I don't want to butcher someone's name because I think it's very disrespectful.
No, I hear you. Yeah, absolutely.
My wife's name is Junia, and people mispronounce it all the time. And it baffles me when she says her name, and then people can't repeat it back to them. It's like, is it a hearing problem or, what is this? So I'm kind of like, okay, if you take it in a different direction, awesome. But I still think Henry deserves, his chance to really be, Superman and get a proper sequel and get a chance to cap off his time as this character. You said he was carved out of Marvel. I agree with you. I said to my wife, I'm like Tyler Hoechlin's Superman feels like the everyman, the average man Superman, where I could see him kind of blending in and no one noticing he's Superman. He's fit, he's in shape, but I could feel like he's kind of like we're buddies. Henry Cavill's, I'm like, there's no way that anyone's mistaking this Adonis for little me Clark Kent, and not Superman.
Yeah.
But another thing, Man of Steel was not designed to be the start of a universe. If you go back and look at its origin, I don't know if you knew this, but I've tried to find the article for years, and I haven't. But in the original Green Lantern script, there was supposed to be a scene where the Ring was searching on Earth, and it went by Clark Kent. And it scans him and says Kryptonian, and then moves on to find an Earthling. And they wanted it to be Henry Cavill. And they said, no, our film is its own thing. We don't want to be tied with anything else.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. That then after Man of Steel, they're like, okay, we're going to use this and create our own universe. And we see kind of what's happened since then.
I think I think part of that is the Christopher Nolan influence. I remember he was very adamant that his Dark Knight films obviously exist completely on their own. I remember he was adamant that that Justice League movie that George Miller was supposed to direct not happen because he didn't want it overlapping with his movies, which is funny now, right? Because DC, it's like the exact polar opposite. Like, hey, whatever, catch as catch can. It's just everybody do their own thing, which I think to some extent is a direct reaction to Christopher Nolan keeping things so close to the chest. I think some of the folks at Warner Brothers would say that essentially limited what they were able to do with the DC universe. Mm-hmm. So I think the idea of Man of Steel being an island was an outgrowth of that. I mean, that said, I mean, the movie does have like a little Easter egg with the Wayne satellite or whatever that is, right?
That's all post. That's all post. You can change out the
right.
computer.
So, but even that, you know what I mean? It's stuff where it's still at arm's length, you know. A quote unquote universe is still at arm's length. So I don't fault them for that initial, the initial approach of doing it there. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, Iron Man did the same thing, other than the little piece at the end with Sam Jackson. It's its own thing. I think that where the DC folks got into trouble was trying to very quickly ramp up to compete with Disney and Marvel, and without even getting into the relative quality of the follow-up films. I'm just looking at audience reaction. It feels like it's not what Warner Bros. Would have hoped for.
Mm-hmm. I've often said that I wish that with BVS, I wish I didn't know that Gal was Wonder Woman. Mm-hmm. Because if you watch that film not having that knowledge, you could almost believe that she's a Talia al Ghul. Like if the way she talks, the way she references stuff, the way she's with Bruce, like you could see it. And then I kind of wish we didn't know that they just one of those like, oh, Gal is cast in a mystery role. And, oh, okay, cool, And then you're watching the film, and, they have that line, Mrs. Prince, Miss Prince. And then you could have been like, are for real? And then she drops in, and you just would have lost your mind.
Nice, yeah.
And because I agree with you, like, they just were like, let's just go. Let's do this, Yeah. And it, good or bad, I don't mind having like this is the movie Batman, this is the TV Batman, or whatever. It gets more confusing when I have this is Bruce Wayne on this show, this is Bruce Wayne on this show, then this is Bruce Wayne on this, and in a weird way, we kind of have almost 4 Bruce Waynes right now.
Yeah, right.
Because we have the really poorly cast, and I say this, version on Titans. The actor is not bad. I just don't really see him as Bruce. To me, he's more of a refined Alfred. And then I think they had a person play the face of Bruce Wayne, but he wasn't Bruce Wayne on Batwoman. So we've already identified what Bruce Wayne looks like in that universe. Then you have Pattinson and then still Affleck. So there's 4, at this moment. So the property, I think, right, like you said, right now, like it can get watered down or confusing, but at the same time, it's nice to have different stories. I would love to see that documentary that they had talked about producing about the George Miller. There was a group of filmmakers who were, this was years ago, we're going to work on it. And I would love to see, and it was shortly after those behind the scene photos and costume tests pictures came out. They had talked about making a documentary, because I love the whatever happened to the Death of Superman Return, or can't talk, the Death of Superman Lives, whatever happened to it documentary. Mm-hmm. Have you watched that?
I've seen bits of it. I haven't seen the whole thing.
It is a really interesting documentary to watch, because sometimes I forgot when this was supposed to take place. Like in my brain, I thought like 97, because it talks about, talks and post conversations like 97-ish, and then they talk about, well, when this shut down, these people went and worked on the Matrix. Because for some reason in my brain, because of how my life happened, 97 and 99 were like super far apart. Because to me, like it was that 97 was middle school, child, we moved to Ohio in 98, and then 99 was my freshman year of high school. So like it's like childhood into teenager years. So it's like they have this distinction of like 97. I think, oh my gosh, that was the bad year for comic book movies. Steel, Spawn, Batman and Robin.
That's right.
And then 99, I think, The Matrix, Episode 1. But they weren't that far apart,
Right.
So I highly recommend checking that out. The only negative about that documentary is there's no, like, interviews with Nicolas Cage.
Right.
There's, like, release footage or whatever of him, but there's no, like, sit-down interview with Nicolas Cage about it. And I'm like, they get Tim Burton there. And he's talking about it, and they get the writers of the different scripts to talk about it. But I was like, man, to hear Nick sit down and like actually get to talk about it would have been really eye-opening. It's one of those what ifs.
Yeah.
And it baffles me that the studio never knows what to do with Superman. Like you listen, like the Superman, the J.J. Abrams flyby script. How he was going to make him like Kryptonian royalty, and like his uncle was coming for him, almost like very Shakespearean.
Yeah.
And then you read, like I said, the Superman Lives script, and you're like, this is bizarre. And then what else baffles me is just talking about the description of the characters. You would think that Superman, that's perfect for the big screen. Batman, that's perfect for a TV series. But it seems the other way around is what's worked.
Yeah, it's true.
How many TV series have we had of Superman? 4?
Yeah.
5, if we count Superboy. So, The Adventures of Superman, Superboy, Lois and Clark, Smallville, and now Superman and Lois. And then Batman TV series, we've had Batman 66, kind of Gotham. I'll give you Gotham. And that's it.
That's about it.
But Batman, in cinema has been the spectacle.
Right.
So as a fan, what just in summary, like your feelings of just the Lois and Clark TV series?
Well, I think that Lois and Clark, I'll always have a very specific affinity for it because that show, it started fall of 93 just as the Death and Return storyline was ending in the comics. And so that to me as a Superman fan was kind of this peak moment of like, that was a moment where I as a Superman fan got to be like, see, he's awesome, like showing the rest of the world because Superman has always had that perception of being stodgy or whatever. And that was the whole reason they did the storyline. So I, as a fan, was at the peak of my fandom, and that was at 93, right? So that was heading into my freshman year. When that show started, I was 100% on board. And I to this day, I think the first season is fantastic. I think the pilot movie is one of the best Superman movies, in terms of that version of that character. That is about as pure a distillation of the post-crisis Superman as we've ever gotten in live action, period. And so in that sense, Dean Cain was a great Clark Kent, that version. So I'll always have a fondness for it. And, I see sometimes people on Twitter are dogging on that show, and I'm kind of like, well, I mean, you can't compare it to Smallville and the Arrowverse and all that other stuff. Like it was 1993. It's like mocking Batman 66 because it's not as good as The Dark Knight. Like it's just you have to contextualize these things. So for me, that's Lois and Clark. I think after season 1, it fell off a bit. Like it especially if you watch it now. I mean, it looks cheap. It looks like they shot it on the Warner Brothers backlot, which of course they did. And they lost the thread a little bit because I think what made that show work initially was sort of the recognition, like we don't have blockbuster money, so let's focus on the relationship. And I think for season 2 and on, I think they probably got, network notes being like, no, we need more villains. And so that's how you get, Sherman Hemsley and Emma Sands and Bronson Pinchot, and kind of like they're doing like the Batman 66 thing where it's like a gimmicky villain of the week. But the heart of that show was the relationship. And that's why I really plugged into it, because, and I think this is a very long-winded way of getting to what you were saying about why Superman works on TV, I think, is because it's not so much look at him like pushing planets around. To me, it's look at this god pretend to be a man. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
What's funny is, for as much as Superman is a sci-fi character, I like the more grounded stories. Like you just said, I like seeing him interact, and like the older comics where he was dealing with crime and like, more normal type stuff than like, I gotta fly off into space and fight this. I liked this idea of almost the fish out of water, like this, like you said, this godlike person doing the right thing and being a representative of like morality and goodness and hopefulness to people. And I highly recommend Lois and Clark, the first season. And second season is not bad because the second season, it's good. It's the third, like it really jerked me because my wife and I, we watched it a couple years back. We watched it straight. I got all 4 seasons on DVD, and we were just watching it straight through. And when Lois comes back and has like the shorter hair, and they did like the memory loss, and it felt like you said, like it got gimmicky and it just kind of lost what it started with.
Yeah.
And that pilot movie was shot on film to be like a TV movie that if it didn't get picked up for series, they would have this Superman TV movie.
Right.
Because you can definitely see after the pilot some changes at the costume, his hair, the boots, as the series continued. And, growing up as a child, that was kind of more of my Superman. It was on Sunday nights, and I had to always fight my mom. Either I would win out and get to watch Lois and Clark, or she would watch Sequest.
Right.
Most
For those
people,
first 2 seasons, right? Yeah.
Most people don't get the reference when I mention Sequest. They're like, what's that? So I'm like, maybe Zaki will get it.
Oh, I remember well. It was Sequest on NBC and Murder, She Wrote was on CBS, and the expectation was that Sequest would beat Lois and Clark, and Murder, She Wrote would beat them both. And what ended up happening is Lois and Clark ended up being the winner in all 3, which it ended up getting Murder, She Wrote canceled after 12 seasons.
I mean, sidestep on Murder, She Wrote. It's like when I watch Murder, She Wrote with my grandma and I watch Scooby-Doo with my kids, I think, do these people have a complex? Because it's like everywhere they go, there's either someone dressed as a ghost they have to solve, or there's someone being killed that she has to solve.
Jessica Fletcher was just the Grim Reaper, yeah.
I'm like, I felt bad. Like, Jessica Fletcher's coming. Nope, keep her out of here. Like, she stays on that side of town. We're okay over here. And, so, in the 90s you had Lois and Clark, and then we had the animated series, and then what are your, we're kind of just going through the history here, and, your thoughts just, on what the build up and everything for Superman Returns.
Oh my God. I mean, I was so pumped. I mean, I for me, the fact that it was meant to sort of exist within the universe that Richard Donner started us out in, the Salkind movies, made me very excited. The movie itself was a disappointment to me in the sense of I appreciated sort of what Singer was going for, and I still think it's a very beautiful movie. I mean, it's very well shot, and Brandon Routh, again, he's terrific. I just think it's just not a movie that I tend to revisit very often. I don't think I've watched it the whole way through since it was in theaters, and I feel like Bryan Singer didn't. I was going to say didn't really get it, but that sounds presumptuous. I think here's what I'm going to say. I think his approach was certainly in hindsight a mistake, because he wanted it to echo the milieu of those original films, but the film itself is so dour and sort of self-important that's not what Donner did in that first movie. Mm-hmm. Right? There was, even if we just cut out the sequels, the first movie it takes itself seriously, but it has a twinkle, and it knows when to laugh at itself, and I feel like Singer was just singing from a completely different hymnal, and so you can point to like, oh, the Fortress of Solitude, and obviously the use of the Williams theme, but like other than those elements, can you really, and of course Brandon Routh looking very similar to Chris Reeve, but can you really, just based on Superman Returns, say it lives in the same world as those earlier films? Like, I just don't see it. The Daily Planet is different. Lois Lane is different. Everything is different.
It's how we talked about Spider-Man, in the MCU, like Spider-Man Homecoming, where we didn't get the origin, but we felt like we knew this character and his world. Yeah. Superman Returns is kind of like that, where we feel like we know this character, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't know this character.
Yeah.
Like, where do you fit? Like, how, like, in this world, Kate Bosworth was the worst Lois Lane. I'm on record for saying that multiple times. I like Brandon's performance. I watched that movie, but it's weird because I'll maybe watch it about once a year, just as kind of like, because there's scenes in it that I love. There's imagery that I love. I like the color in that film, like the cinematography. I like Sam Huntington as Jimmy Olsen. He's my favorite Jimmy Olsen. He found the perfect balance of being the, not kid, but like youthful enthusiast Jimmy Olsen, where I could see him and Clark being friends.
Right.
But at the same time, like, there's pieces in that world where I'm like, this doesn't fit with what was done. And I'm just like, it deserved to be treated better. And it kind of makes me think of, if you go back and watch the first X-Men film, how long has it been since you've watched X-Men?
Yeah, probably at some point in the last year I've seen it.
It's a good movie, but you realize how slow it is. How there's not that much action. If it's not Wolverine fighting, there's not a whole lot going on. And that's kind of what this film felt like watching Superman Returns. It was like Bryan Singer was doing the same kind of structure and beats that he had done with X-Men, where it's this very kind of story, but at the same time was the story of this Superman what we wanted to see. And I would say most people are like, no, because it just did not feel part of it. And that's sad. Now, did you get to watch Brandon on Crisis?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was fantastic.
I really enjoyed what Brandon was able to do on Crisis.
Yeah.
I felt like it was he got more of his own Superman identity. Because he got to play a Reeve-ish like character, but he wasn't trapped in trying to be him.
And yet, I would argue that, and just echoing what you're saying, I mean, the Routh Superman in Crisis felt more like the Chris Reeve one than what we saw in Superman Returns. It's the darndest thing.
It is. I could see that, and he got to play, the character farther down the line of his career than taking it back. I have a strong love for Superman Returns, just because of when it took place, like as far as where my life was, and being the first Superman film that I got to see on the big screen. I saw it, I think, 3 times in the theaters. That was back when they did the 3D, but it wasn't the whole film in 3D. It was like the certain scenes where it would flash. Now put on your 3D IMAX glasses, and like it was the plane rescue, him running in the corn, Fortress of Solitude, and the continent of Kryptonite at the end. So it really made those scenes stand out because you hadn't been wearing these glasses the whole time, and it baffles my mind that the bank robbery scene in that movie was a reshoot or additional photography.
Right.
Because they were like, we need some sort of action here. And they did that scene, and it's a great scene. So kind of as we're moving, your thoughts, feelings, and everything about when Smallville came out.
Oh, I mean, I remember being super excited because that was during the era of the comics when I had gotten re-energized by the comics because Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness were doing their run at the time, and the books had all kind of they had like done a soft reboot in the comics at the time. So I was super excited then, and that was at the time Smallville. My expectation was that the show would be slightly different than what it ended up becoming, and so I would say Smallville, for me, that the 10 years of that show being on signaled my transition as a fan, where I became less married to quote unquote my version of the mythology, right? So in other words, my expectation was Smallville would stick reasonably close to what was then, the comic book history of the post-crisis version, and Smallville kind of went off on its own and did its own thing. And so at that moment, for me, it was actually helpful because I was able to say, okay, this is a mythology that's going to keep changing, and people are going to keep plugging in to different aspects and different things, and all those things are going to go off in different ways, and that's just what Superman is. And for me, it made me, first of all, able to accept Smallville as its own thing and appreciate it, and I still have a great deal of affinity for it, but it also just made me appreciative of just the many facets of the myth, Mm-hmm. And so by the time we get to Superman Returns, which was the fourth or fifth season of Smallville, I was at that place where I could just be like, man, isn't it great how Superman just keeps getting reinvented, and they were able to keep doing new things with it.
It's very interesting because everything you said is true, but the one little difference is, if you watch it with Superman Returns coming on the horizon, if you watch the first 4 seasons, Smallville kind of crafts its own identity with a lot of the mythology. Yeah. When they bring Superman Returns in, which would be along with season 5, 6-ish because of production and release and all that stuff, they start shifting more towards the Donnerverse, for lack of a better term. Like they start going with more of the music, the imagery, and more solidifying itself as that style, kind of than where they had kind of crafted their own kind of mythology. And it's just interesting in retrospect. I loved Smallville because at the time it came out, I was in high school. So it was like, this is me, Clark Kent. Like, this is me now. Like, I identify with this, and that kind of became that show in the back of my life of high school into college, out into marriage. My wife and I got married the year that Smallville ended.
Wow.
And, we got married, and then like 2 months later it ended, 3 months, whatever. So it's just, to me, it's like this very big piece of like the background. Like I had this chunk of Superman that was kind of more tailored to where I was in my life. And I, over the years, I've come to really like the idea of, I've never been a huge fan of the idea of Superboy, as in Clark Kent, putting on the costume and doing all this stuff as Superboy, then just like waking up one day like, you know what? I'm a man now.
I am now a man. Yeah.
I turned 18 today. I'm now Superman.
It's been long enough.
It's just, I like, much as like the Donner film kind of alludes to, this time of him growing and experiencing things. And maybe he did do adventures, but he didn't wear the suit.
Right.
I like that, so that when he gets to be a man, carve out his identity, ready to kind of present himself to the world, he's Superman.
Totally agree.
So we kind of shifted the order a little bit because now our last little part of the discussion is the current Superman and Lois. And like with Smallville, I like this show because it's now feels a little bit more of the Superman show towards me. It's not perfect, but I have now been married for, I'll be 10 years this weekend.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I have 2 little ones. You know, I am a father. My kids aren't as old as his kids, but I have a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old and a soon-to-be 4-year-old. And so it's like I'm relating to this character on a new level of where I am in my life. And it's a great kind of companion piece type series for how, Smallville was my teenage and young years. Now this is like where I am as an adult. So what is your feelings, takes on, like you said, you got to see the first 2, which I feel like the first 2 episodes work more like a film. I know it was directed by the same person. So I kind of looked through this next episode to see what changes as far as production, direction, style. Now as we kind of settle into now more of the weekly format for the series,
Right.
What are your just feelings of this right now, of the series, seeing Tyler as he appeared on, had you watched all of his other appearances before this, or how are you feeling about all of this?
I watched his all the previous appearances in the Arrowverse, and I've liked him as Superman from the beginning. I thought that the way in which they found a way to have him exist in the same universe as Supergirl, but off to one side. Initially that first season, of Supergirl, because he wasn't in it, that felt a little ham-fisted to me. But I think, you sort of just have to, you squint your eyes a little bit, like, all right, man, I get why they're doing this, But the way they said, oh, he's off to, with Lois to Argo or wherever to have a baby and stuff. I like that. I remember thinking, like, I'd be down for a Superman show with him, but I'm not a big fan of sort of like the production value of some of these Arrowverse shows. So that was always in the back of my mind. And I like that this show, it looks like they've put some money into it. I think the Superman stuff that we've seen feels very comparable to what Snyder did in Man of Steel, both in terms of how it's filmed, which is, a little bit more gradation, but also just like, the action. It doesn't feel made for TV. And so that to me is a good sign that, Warner Brothers recognizes, like, it's Superman. We gotta make it look like it cost a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, just echoing what you said, I like that it's Superman at a new stage of his life. And it occurs to me, like, because of the multiverse approach they're taking, where whatever, we're doing this here and that there and whatever, they're able to do a story like this. Like, I think part of the reason we never got that Superman Returns sequel is there was a part of Warner Brothers that was like, well, Superman's not supposed to have a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and they felt boxed in. Whereas here, there's plenty of that out there in some form or another, and, we'll probably get that again at some point, but that's not what this is. This is doing Superman as a dad. And so going back to what I was saying earlier, when you have a god trying to be a man, trying to pretend he's a man, well, the most powerful man in the world is just trying to deal with 2 kids who are going through puberty. I mean, that's new, that's different, and something small that this, the pilot episode did, which I mentioned, I think I mentioned this in my review or somewhere else, I can't remember, but we see Martha Kent dies, and we see that's something we've never seen before.
Right.
The death of in media anyway, right? And and we see Clark mourn for her, and that's something we've never seen before. And that's what intrigues me is, like, okay, we have this new status quo. Where do we go with it? And what I like about this show is it says something about how plugged into just our sort of pop culture bloodstream these characters are, that even though it's not a continuation, it's not a sequel to Smallville or to Lois and Clark, it feels like it is.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like Fuller House or one of these shows where it's like, well, here they are, 20 years later. Let's see what's going on with these characters now. And that's what I like about it.
And that is how, what I like about it is back to our whole reboot conversation. It's like, I don't, as much as I want another Superman series, it's like, what can you give me that's different? And now you're giving me an element that's different. What's interesting is you go back and watch the Kirk Allen or the George Reeves, Ma and Pa disappear very quickly.
Right.
And I like the fact that Clark has to deal with the loss of his mom. We've always worked on like the loss of his father. I like that now Clark, the only kind of parental figure in this series that Clark has is the antithesis of his father, which is Sam Lane.
Yeah.
His boys don't have that mom, pa, grandparent influence that Clark would want. It's a different stage. His and Lois' relationship. It's nice to see that. It's nice to see this new dynamic. It's fresh. I like feeling that I'm kind of growing with these characters. I liked in the comics a lot when they did the Dan Jurgens. If you've not read it, I highly recommend the Dan Jurgens Lois and Clark series, which is right before Rebirth. It's how they kind of brought the character back, and we won't go into all that, but just that trade is a great read. I recently got to talk with Dan Jurgens, and that was just a wonderful conversation with him about his legacy and writing. And Superman, I feel like when they brought him in Supergirl in season 2, I loved it. I loved the way they portrayed him. And my buddy Brian actually talked about how if you look at it, each time he appeared, he represented something different. He was like the bigger than life person when he first came into Supergirl. Then he's like this, like the hero. And then it's like, you kind of start to whittle him down. And then when he get him in crisis, it's now like Superman has a just born father. And he's just trying to help out and put things together. And it's building him to a new level that we've not, seen him interact before.
Yeah.
And because, part of me is like, they're like, yeah, we liked having him. And they wanted reasons to have him back. But they didn't know what to do with him. Because they're like, we can't have him outshine Supergirl on her show. We can't have him outshine Oliver. He's the face of the Arrowverse, we're about to kill off Stephen Amell. We can't have Superman outshine him here. And it's one of those things where it's like, what do we do? And then they're like, now we're getting the respect to the character and to the actor portraying the character that he deserves.
Yep.
And when they cast Tyler, I was like, huh. I was familiar with just his work on Teen Wolf. And I thought the first 2 seasons of Teen Wolf were pretty good. It's still a teen drama, but they did difference in mythology, which was cool. And I liked his character. So I was like, okay. That first picture came out, and I was like, ooh. And then it's like, the CW, I feel like, they're like, okay, we need to get a picture out. Just grabs him off the street, puts him in the costume, takes a picture. Because most every costume reveal is, look at the Supergirl, the Flash, both of their costume reveal photos were, But then when those set photos come out, you're like, there it is. I see it. I see it now. And I wanted more with this character to see this world because, it was a new face on Superman, so maybe we can get a new story. We have a Superman with Supergirl for the first time, like official Supergirl. We know how Smallville went, doing things together. And I will admit that the shirt rip that he does in that episode of Supergirl, he runs down the alley, takes the tie off, rips the shirt. My favorite shirt rip scene for Superman. It gives me the chills. It gives me, the emotion of just, he's in a hurry. Watch him, take off. And one thing I had read was that this show, maybe I read it or heard it, I don't know. What they wanted to kind of compete more with like the HBO series, So
Right.
so they put more money into it. They initially it was just going to be the 13 episodes. Now it's 15. And it got renewed, which is happy news for season 2. They wanted to give it a bigger budget for the CW, and I, like you, was like, I know the production on some of these shows. Like, I feel like, not bashing on anything, but like, I feel like Batwoman is like the most underfunded show. It's like their C stringers, or like production is over there. Like, because some of the stuff I'm like, I've seen you do better work on some of the other shows as far as production and, that behind the scenes stuff. Nothing against the actors or anything like that, just production wise. But I feel like this Superman Lois has just kind of elevated that, and I'm very excited to see where the series goes.
Yeah.
Well, I know your time is precious. You're a busy man. I told you I'd keep you to an hour. What are anything else you just like to say about this? Your love for the character, your, best experiences, hope for the character, or just final kind of thoughts on just Superman in your relationship?
Well, one thing I'll say, and this is something I say all the time on Twitter to anybody who'll listen, is reinvention is just part of the myth, and just because the version you like, the general you changes, doesn't mean that new versions won't be just as valuable and precious to everyone else. And that's very much reflected in what you've talked about, during our conversation. I tell people this all the time. It's like, it doesn't always have to be Christopher Reeve. It doesn't always have to be Dean Cain or anybody, but each of those is somebody's favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching the pilot, rewatching it, I should say, with my wife. And I was telling her that I was like, there's a whole generation of kids right now who Tyler Hoechlin is going to be their Superman. And I told my wife, I was like, that is awesome.
Yeah.
And the fact that the character has lasted this long is because he represents something that we need. What we need is the example of somebody who can do anything and have anything and be anything, and the one thing he chooses to be is a good guy. And that's what we can learn from, and that's why Superman matters. That's why Superman will always matter. It's not the super, it's the man. Just how to be a good man.
I really couldn't say it any better myself. I think that Tyler's Superman is going to be Solomon's kind of Superman, because my son is like, I've let him watch it with me. Like it comes on at 9, which is technically his bedtime, but on Tuesdays it's a special time, and I've noticed that little things there's like little tropes that you kind of see in stories over and over, like with the will they fall in love? Oh no, they're not together. Or like in the pilot, when Superman got stabbed with the kryptonite, Solomon's like, oh my God, Dad, what's going to happen? Is Superman going to die? And as adults, we're like, no, it's the pilot. He'll be okay. Like they can't, but I'm seeing that in that energy in him watching it with me, that I think this will be kind of that like how Lois and Clark kind of was for me as a kid. Like that was like this big deal. Like this is going to be kind of that, even though we've watched all these other Superman, the fact that he's experiencing it live, so to speak, is what I think is going to imprint on him with this character. And
it's it's just to pick up on what you're saying. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
You're talking about the Lois and Clark. One of my clearest memories of watching that show when it first aired, the finale, the season 1 finale was like a cliffhanger. It was like a 2-parter. So the first part of the season 1 finale, where Lex has proposed to Lois, she says yes, and Superman is kind of watching from outside, and then he goes off to the Arctic, and he's like screaming, no,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easy to watch that now, almost 30 years later, and be like, oh, that's cheesy, right? But I remember being a freshman in high school, and just, man, that spoke to me,
Mm-hmm.
that angst, and I mean, there's a purity to that, and so what you're saying, like, every generation they find their in,
This is my last thing I'm gonna ask you. I meant to ask you this earlier. because this is always kind of, I want to just kind of get your idea or thought process on it. This has always kind of bugged me. In Richard Donner, we're going to go just kind of sidestep here. In Superman 1 and Superman 2, I know that it was like one story that they broke down and they were filming them simultaneously, shooting them back to back. And I know that, they had to compromise the end of Superman 1, and they took like the ending from Superman 2 of him spinning the world back, because that was supposed to be in Superman 2, and put it in Superman 1. The part that's always kind of bothered me was Lois supposed to die initially in Superman 1 or 2? Like, how did that work out? If the end of Superman 1, because like when you watch the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, it starts in a weird place because it's kind of showing you, well, this is how my Superman 1 would have ended. And then I'm going to start part 2. Because like you talked about the yell, like that scene in Superman 1 where he like does the no, and then screams and flies into the sky.
Yeah.
It gets me. On a side note, I wish they wouldn't have had the part where he stops and hears Jor-El talking to him. I wish it just would have been him flying straight up, and then you could have done like a voiceover of Jor-El and then start spinning the world. Like, I don't like the hesitation, just from an editing point of view.
Sure.
But that's always kind of bugged me in the story. Like, where does the death of Lois fit? Was she supposed to have died? Was that something that they did as a side story? Like, maybe we'll do this, or, how did that come to be? I don't know if you know anything, or just I've never thought about it. Because, for the longest time, I never really thought about it until like the past year when I was watching, because I did a 2x2. Like, I watched 2 and then I watched the other 2 for comparison. And I started thinking about the story. So,
I think the initial plan was Superman, the movie ends on a straight cliffhanger. So Lois is not dead, but it's like the basically everything after the bomb goes off was not intended to be in the movie originally. So the bomb goes off, Zod and them are freed, and they're like, free, and then credits, to be continued next year or whatever in Superman 2. Then, 2/3 of the way through, they're like, we don't even know if we're going to be able to do a sequel, let's just come up with an ending. And so at that point I don't know if the specific execution in the film was the way they intended to execute it in Superman 2, but my guess is Lois would have died at the end of Superman 2, because I think that's the only thing that makes sense as Superman violating that basic thing of it's forbidden for you to interfere, right? I think by adding it into this is why I'm not a big fan of the Donner cut, because to me it's like, is this Superman just doing this now all the time?
yeah.
He's like, oops, screwed up, I need a mulligan.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, I totally, and that's why like you have to watch the Donner cut. It's like the thing in the back of your mind, like you have to watch that beginning where like, this is the end of Superman 1. What I'm thinking of didn't happen. This is how it was supposed to end.
Right,
now,
exactly.
because I, for the longest time, I'm like you said, you're like, is this just what he does now? Like, oh, that messed up. It's back to your Atari reset. Oh, I messed up.
Between turning back time and the amnesia kiss, which he does multiple times in those films, you're like, man, Superman's a dick.
Yeah, I mean that, and then he goes back to the diner and fights that guy.
He beats up the guy who didn't do anything to him.
Because I'm like, didn't he spin the world back and then goes back to the diner?
Yeah.
So that guy never fought him because he reversed. It's like, how far back did you go? Like,
what's funny about that, by the way, is like, even if you remove the turning back time thing, like in the theatrical cut of Superman 2, that's still a dickish thing for Superman to do. Mm-hmm. Where he's like, I'm gonna beat this guy into a coma. That'll show him for humiliating me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because he turns back time far enough that Zod and them go back into the Phantom Zone.
Yeah.
So it's a conundrum. He's like, well, then none of that movie actually happened. Like,
yeah, I'm not a fan of that as the as the end. I mean, just in general, I think the Donner cut to me is like, it's like it's like a DVD extra. I don't consider that the true Superman 2. I'm just like, no, the one we got in theaters, for all its faults, it is what it is,
And I mean, I agree with you. Like, there's things I like in the Donner cut. Like, I like the Christopher Reeve screen test with Margot Kidder.
Yeah.
I like seeing that. There's things that I like, but it's one of those, like, we never really got the sequel that we deserved or that they wanted, and we take the best with what we have for the story. That makes sense with how you put that, with how they probably came up with the ending and looking at
That's my guess, yeah.
I mean, it makes the most logical sense of, like, let's just give this the best emotional beat. If we can't do a sequel, if we do, we'll figure it out.
Like think about it. Like, the idea of Superman 2 being the movie where he's been on this emotional journey with her, she knows who he is, he's finally shares his secret, and then she dies, and the sacrifice he's making is he's unwinding all of that too. He's losing this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's more poignant, right?
Mm-hmm. It is.
Yeah.
Well, Zaki, I want to thank you for coming on, just chatting with us. Like, I thought it would just, like I said, I thought it'd be fun. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts, and you put things so much more eloquently sometimes than I can, because I stumble on my words and freeze because I'm like, wait, I know what I want to say, but how do I say it? So I thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Any chance to talk about Superman, I'm happy to do it.
All right. And remember, everyone, check out Zaki's podcast. If you like, what he talked about today, I highly recommend the Movie Film Podcast. It's just a good time of two best friends talking movies and great insight. And it's a good time.
Thank you so much.
Look up in the sky.
Look up in the sky.
Look in the sky.